Thought I would begin with just a couple of observations from each of you about what we saw Tuesday night. And we'll start with sort of the national landscape. Mark Graul, tell me what jumped out at you Tuesday night.
Well, I think from a national perspective, three things really caught my attention. First of all, I think that while Barack Obama obviously won in a comfortable margin, I think with the exception of Wisconsin, which I think we'll get into a little bit, in a lot of places the voting patterns didn't shift as dramatically as you would have thought. When you start drilling down into county by county numbers, you'll see McCain actually ended up winning a lot of counties that George Bush won, just not by the same amount. Which gets to the thing that I really noticed was that Republicans in some instances really did stay home. There were a lot of Republicans who did not get out and vote. I would argue, and as Mike said, I worked for the Bush campaign in 2004, that campaign had a laser-like focus, not on trying to convince anybody George Bush was the right guy to be president, but get those who already believe that to the polls, whereas the McCain campaign was much more largely focused on trying to persuade people who are trying to decide between the two candidates to pick their guy. So rather than focusing on a GOTV effort that for the Bush campaign really started in January, the McCain campaign spent a lot of time on trying to persuade people. Unfortunately, they weren't very successful with that, but in the meantime, they left behind a lot of Republican voters who are tough to get to the polls. You know, if you're not going to vote in a presidential race, it's hard to get you to the polls, but they did not spend enough time on trying to persuade people to vote who were going to vote for Republican if they got into the polls. And then the final observation I have is that while it was a bad night for Republicans, and it was a difficult night for a lot of us in the race that I worked on, certainly the congressional race, but it wasn't quite, I would argue, and I don't know if Paul agrees with me or not, but I would argue 2006 was a bigger landslide election or bigger wave election than last night, or than Tuesday night. We had a lot of Republican House races, Wisconsin actually being an exception, that the Republican who a lot of people thought were going to lose ended up holding on. Over in Minnesota, you saw that in a couple races. There were a few races in some of the other parts of the country where House Republican open seats or incumbents who a lot of people thought weren't going to make it ended up winning. So I think that when history is written, you'll see 2006 was sort of the big splash of wave, and then 2008 carried it through, but not quite as strong. And then the final observation I have is I don't know what Paul and company are going to do in 2 years when they can't run against George Bush. So we'll, it'll be interesting.
Didn't Ronald Reagan run against Washington for 8 years? Anyway.
What was your takeaway from Tuesday?
Well, I want to start by saying, we're all going to get real clinical and analytical because that's our job. But I have to say that, I knew Obama was going to win for months. And I knew what the margin was going to be, basically. And there was no surprise in it. And yet, I have to, I called my wife and said, get our daughter, who's upstairs, who's 16 years old and worked on the campaign, get her to the television set because I knew they were going to call it. And when it happened, I have to admit, I was overcome with emotion. I mean, I just, as an American, just overcome with what has happened. And that may not count for much down the road because he's going to have to make decisions and take actions like any president will, and it'll be tough. But just the sheer fact of what happened, I still am astounded by at some fundamental level. Having said that, I think the three things that I would point to, one is that I speculated all along, and I'd maybe even said it here in the spring, but I really felt that the African-American turnout and greater strength for Obama and the young people would, by their simple strength alone, would wipe out the Kerry-Bush deficit of 3 points from 2004, and I think that happened. Obama won voters under 30 by 66 to 32. Turnout wasn't that much bigger, but just the sheer fact that he won by 2-1 among voters under 30, and the African-American turnout did go up. When you look at the comparison of the vote, overall national turnout is not up very much at all, partly because I think what Mark just said, some Republicans stayed home, partly because a lot of the country realized it's over, we're not part of this. But the place where the turnout did go up, other than the key states like Indiana and Missouri, and it's funny that Indiana, Missouri, North Carolina became the key states, that tells you a lot, Virginia, but the Deep South, the turnout went up, and that obviously is unquestionably, I think, African-American voters. So that's number one. Secondly, you cannot look back at this and say that anything other than that the economic collapse, beginning with Lehman Brothers going bankrupt, was huge. I think Obama wins anyway, but he doesn't win by 6-7 points. It's a much smaller margin. it just set in motion, I think, the real dynamic of this fall. And you look at the whole northeastern quadrant, and particularly the upper Midwest and the industrial belt from Pennsylvania to almost Missouri, and it just was devastating to McCain and the Republicans, and I think the economic news had a big part to do with that. And the final thing is, I just think you have to go back and look at the candidate performance and to realize that in many ways, the guy who was new and supposedly risky in offering change became the steady, calm, cool hand, and compared to the guy who was offering experience and national security strength and a safe haven, you know, in some ways, particularly I think at the time of the financial news and him suspending his campaign, became kind of the risky, uncertain, and unhinged candidate. I think they almost did a role reversal. And I think you have to give not only Obama credit for his campaign's performance, which was terrific, but he himself as a candidate. The guy simply never made a major mistake in 2 years. And here you go. He's president.
A quick response from each of you to the question of whether or not this is a mandate. Is it a mandate? And if it is, what's it a mandate for?
Well, it's a mandate for change. I mean, John Kennedy only won by 100,000 votes, but believe me, he didn't stop, and he didn't refuse to push forward and start talking about the new frontier in a very different kind of energy. So I think from that standpoint, anytime you change party and you change power like this, and particularly for somebody he was the clearest evidence of change. We can all argue about what the change may be, and that's part of your question. But he was the clearest candidate who embodied change from day one in this election. And he's the one that won. And I think that means something. Now, having said that, I think there are built-in conflicts here among pieces of the 52% that voted for Barack Obama. And many, of course, are just simply saying change the policies of Bush, get us out of the war in Iraq, which may or may not happen as fast as people would like, or turn the economy around, get this country going again. And that obviously is going to be a huge test for Obama. Beyond that, though, there are many different types of demands that are going to be put on him from the African-American community, from seniors concerned about health care, from the liberal side and the activists of the party who may be looking at issues like abortion or gay rights or stem cell research, which is one I think he probably will do pretty quickly, or the environment. I mean, there's a tremendously full plate here and a lot of built-in expectations, and it's going to be tough. But mandate for change, for new direction in the country, for a more effective foreign policy and for a stronger economy, absolutely. Having said that and doing it are, of course, two different things.
Mark? Yeah, I mean, I think anytime any party has the success that the Democratic Party had on an electoral way, there certainly is a mandate. But as Paul laid out, having a mandate and actually fulfilling what that mandate is, because for some people it's a mandate, as Paul said, for radical social change or environmental change or economic policy change. Certainly that was the driving factor in getting a lot of independent voters to the Obama column, was the economy and the blame that they placed on the president and the Republican Party for some of the struggles of the economy. So there is certainly a mandate, but it's not just, it's more, I don't look at it as a mandate as much as it is a great responsibility that President Obama is going to have, and the Democrats in Congress, that matter Madison, to solve a lot of these problems. And if we know anything about the American people, they're very impatient. So they have a short window of time to deal with a lot of competing resources. And one of the things I think you'll see, and you certainly saw it 8 years ago, is there is a pent-up amongst the Democratic Party and more liberal groups, unions, and environmental groups, they've been held down now for 8 years. So how President Obama and his administration deals with that is going to be a very interesting to watch.
There will be pressure from the left. You and I were talking about that when you got here today. There will be pressure on him to move in a direction that